If you're interested in partnering with Magical Storybook English Nanny Bedtime Stories or wanting to know more about sponsorship opportunities, then visit our website www.magical-storybook.com. You can also download free read-along books to accompany our fairy tales. Welcome to Magical Storybook, a collection of children's stories from around the world. Tatterhood. Once upon a time, there was a king and a queen who had no children. This made the queen very sad because she felt that the palace was very dull and lonely. Wherever she travelled in the land, she would see mothers with their children and think how nice it would be if she were like them. "If we had children, it would be very lively here," she said to the king one day. So they decided to adopt a young girl to raise as their own. One day, when the little girl was older, she ran into the palace yard to play with a golden apple. While she was out there, an old beggar woman walked by. She had with her a little girl, and the two children began playing together, tossing the apple between them. Soon they were playing as though they were old friends. The queen watched them for a while from a palace window and then ordered her daughter to come inside. The little girl did as she was told, but she brought the beggar girl in with her too. When the queen saw them entering her apartment holding hands, she told her daughter off. "You are too good to be playing with a tattered beggar's brat," she said. And then she started to push the poor beggar girl down the stairs. "You would not treat me like this if you knew my mother's power," said the girl loudly. The queen asked her to explain what she meant, and the girl told her that her mother could make sure that she had her own children, if she still wanted them. The idea that she could still have children of her own excited the queen, and so she asked the girl to fetch her mother. As soon as the beggar woman walked into the room, the queen said, "Do you know what your daughter is saying? She says that you can bring me my own children. Can you?" The old woman laughed. "Queens should not listen to beggar girls' silly stories," she shouted as she waved and walked out of the room. The queen was angry with the girl, but the girl insisted that what she was saying was true. "Offer my mother something to drink," she said. "I know that she will help you then." So the beggar woman was brought to the queen once more and was given something to drink. When she had finished, she put down her cup and said, "Perhaps I know one way to help you. Ask your servants to bring in 2 pails of water this evening before you go to bed. Then wash yourself in each of them, and afterwards pour the water under your bed. When you look under your bed tomorrow morning, 2 flowers will have sprung up, a beautiful bright one and a wild ugly one. Eat the beautiful flower, but leave the ugly one alone." Then, as she prepared to leave the palace, the beggar warned, "Be careful not to forget that last bit of advice. Eat the beautiful flower, but leave the ugly wild one alone." Then she left. The queen did what the beggar woman told her to do. She had the water brought up in 2 pails, washed herself in both of them, and emptied them under the bed. And when she looked under the bed the next morning, there were 2 flowers. One was wild and ugly, but the other was very bright and beautiful. The queen ate the beautiful flower up at once. It tasted so sweet that she could not stop herself eating the other one too, thinking, "I'm sure that it can't really hurt me." Later that year, the queen gave birth to twin girls. The first was very wild and strange looking, just like the second flower. As soon as she came into the world, she jumped onto the back of a goat and began riding around on it. She picked up a wooden spoon and held it in her hand as she rode. The king and queen were shocked to have been given such a daughter. Immediately after, the second girl was born. She was not wild and strange, but beautiful and sweet-looking, just like the first flower. The king and queen called the elder twin Tatterhood because she looked so ragged, and the hood that she wore was old and tattered. The queen could hardly bear to look at her. The nurses tried to shut her up in a room away from her sister, but it was no good. The twins wanted to be together, and no one could ever keep them apart. One Christmas Eve, when the twins were older, there was a frightful noise and clatter in the hallway outside the Queen's apartment. Tatterhood ran up the stairs to see what had caused it. At first, the Queen would not tell her, but Tatterhood refused to leave until she did. So the Queen eventually informed her that it was a pack of trolls and witches that had come to spend Christmas with them. Tatterhood bravely decided that she would go and drive them away, and she told her family to lock their bedroom doors and not to open them under any circumstances. They agreed, and so off Tatterhood went, looking for witches and trolls, armed only with her wooden spoon and her goat. Her family could hear a great commotion going on outside, and curiosity became too much for Tatterhood's twin sister. She decided to unlock her door and peep out to see what was going on. As soon as she poked her head out through the opening, pop! Out jumped an old witch. She took the girl's head and replaced it with a cow's head. The princess ran back into her room, mooing, while the witch ran away with her head. When Tatterhood returned and saw what had happened, she was very angry with her sister for unlocking her door. But she told her family that she would do whatever she could to set her free from the witch's spell. She asked her father to give her a ship with a strong set of sails and lots of food supplies. She told him that she did not need a crew and that she would sail away with her sister alone. The king agreed. So Tatterhood collected her goat and she and her sister sailed away, heading for the land where the witches lived. When they got there, Tatterhood told her sister to stay hidden on board the ship while she rode on her goat up to the witch's castle. At the castle, Tatterhood looked through an open window and saw her sister's head lying inside the room. She jumped through the window, grabbed hold of it, and then ran away. The witches spotted Tatterhood and chased after her. Then they surrounded her like a swarm of bees. The goat butted them with its horns while Tatterhood attacked them with her wooden spoon. Eventually the witches gave up and left. When she got back to the ship, she swapped her sister's cow head for her normal one, and then they sailed on. They happened to pass another kingdom. The king of this land was a widower and had just one son to keep him company. When he saw the ship arriving on his shores, he sent his messengers down to the beach to find out where it had come from. The men arrived at the ship and saw Tatterhood racing around the deck on her goat. They were amazed by this sight, and when she stopped, they asked her whether anyone else was on board. Tatterhood told them that her sister was in the cabin, but that only their king could look upon her. Back at the palace, the messengers told the king what they had seen and what the girl had said to them. The king was very interested by the girl on the goat and set out to see her for himself. When he arrived, Tatterhood greeted him and brought out her sister to meet him. The king immediately fell head over heels in love with her, and he invited them both back to the palace. After tea, he asked Tatterhood's sister to marry him, but Tatterhood told him that she would not allow her younger sister to marry him unless his son married her. The king asked his son to come and meet Tatterhood, but seeing that she was so wild-looking with tattered clothes, he said that he could never marry someone so ugly. But the king begged his son, and to make his father happy, the prince agreed. The preparations for the great double wedding immediately began. The kitchens and cellars filled the palace hallways with the smells of brewing and baking, and when the day of the weddings arrived, Tatterhood and her sister prepared themselves. Everyone set off for the church. The king and Tatterhood's sister went first, he in a fine carriage and she on a fine horse. People lined the streets to get a glimpse of the beautiful new queen, and the king was very proud. The prince and Tatterhood followed behind, the prince on horseback, while Tatterhood rode beside him on her goat. In her hand she waved her wooden spoon. The prince was so ashamed and felt very sad, walking with his head down as though he was going to a funeral rather than a wedding. All the way there, he did not speak a word. "Are looks so important to you that you cannot find any happiness when you look at me?" asked Tatterhood. But the prince said nothing. "Why don't you talk?" she asked after they had ridden a little further. "Why, what should I talk about?" answered the prince. "Well, you might at least ask me why I ride upon this ugly goat," said Tatterhood. "Why do you ride on that ugly goat?" asked the prince. "Is it an ugly goat?" answered Tatterhood. "Why, it's the most beautiful horse that a bride ever rode on." And immediately the goat turned into a horse, the finest that the prince had ever seen. They rode on a bit further, but the prince was just as sad as before and still could not say a word. So Tatterhood asked him again why he would not talk, and when the prince answered that he did not know what to talk about, she said, "Well, you can ask me why I ride with this ugly spoon in my fist." "Why do you ride with that ugly spoon?" asked the prince. "Is it an ugly spoon?" said Tatterhood. "Why, it's the loveliest silver fan that a bride ever carried." And immediately it became a silver fan, so bright that it glistened. This did little to cheer the prince up, and he still looked just as sad. "Why don't you ask me why I wear this ugly grey hood on my head?" said Tatterhood. "Why do you wear that ugly grey hood on your head?" sighed the prince. "Is it an ugly hood?" answered Tatterhood. "Why, it's the brightest golden crown that a bride ever wore." And it immediately became a crown. "Now, why don't you ask me why my face is so ugly and wild?" she said to the prince. "Yes, why is your face so ugly and wild?" asked the prince. "Am I ugly?" said Tatterhood. "You think that my sister is beautiful, but I am 10 times more beautiful." And when the prince looked at her, he saw that his bride-to-be was the most beautiful woman in the world. After that, he rode with his head held high. Tatterhood looked at his proud face and explained, "I chose to look that way because it was much more interesting. Good looks mean nothing to me. Loving and protecting my family is much more important to me. But as looks are so important to you," she continued, "I will give you a beautiful bride." The prince felt very ashamed, and for the first time he looked at Tatterhood and saw not just a beautiful woman, but an interesting and selfless person. He realised then that if he had taken the time to get to know her, that he would have loved her however she looked. Tatterhood and her sister were married to the king and the prince, and with a new understanding, the prince was finally content. They celebrated for days. The last I heard, they were celebrating still.